Welcome to This Explainer. We're going to dive straight into the fascinating $20 trillion world of housing. And we're doing something a little bit different today. We're going to zoom all the way in on the micro level, the actual everyday math of buying a house, and then we're going to zoom all the way out to look at the macro level, the human psychology that drives entire housing markets to just completely boom and bust.
But first, to really wrap our heads around this, we have to grasp the sheer scale of the market. Real estate is the single biggest asset class in the United States, period. The value of real estate owned directly by U.S. households sits at roughly $20 trillion. $20 trillion. That absolutely dwarfs the direct stock holdings of American households, which are hovering around $6 trillion. So for the typical family, their home isn't just a place to live, it's literally the major source of wealth they're going to accumulate in their entire lifetime.
All right, to map out this explainer, we're hitting 4 key areas today. First, the biggest asset class. Second, decoding mortgage mechanics. Third, the 1930s mortgage revolution. And finally, anatomy of a housing bubble.
Okay, part 1, the biggest asset class, and understanding the 20 trillion buy.
You know when you drive past those massive 50-story commercial skyscrapers and wonder, who actually owns that? Well, for a long time, the answer was basically just wealthy investors using something called a DPP, or a direct participation program. These were, and are, pretty complicated, quiet, limited partnerships. And why set them up this way? Mostly to dodge the corporate profits tax, while also making sure the personal liability of the investors was strictly limited. But here's the catch, because there's always a catch, right? Because they were so complex, you had to be an accredited investor, meaning a millionaire, to even get a seat at the table. It was an incredibly exclusive club.
But that whole game changed in 1960. Everyday investors were rightfully annoyed about being locked out of this massive wealth builder, so Congress stepped in and actually invented the REIT, the Real Estate Investment Trust. Suddenly, anybody could invest in commercial real estate, just like you were buying a stock. Now, to stop these new companies from just becoming speculative short-term flippers, Congress slapped some really strict rules on them. 75% of their assets absolutely must be in real estate, they have to pay out 95% of their income to shareholders, and they're required to hold properties long-term.
Moving on to part 2, decoding mortgage mechanics, where we look at the micro math of buying a home.
So let's zoom all the way down to the individual level. When you go to buy a house, the bank's #1 concern is risk, and they measure that risk using your LTV, your loan-to-value ratio. Basically, if you buy a $200,000 house and you take out a $160,000 loan, your LTV is 80%, meaning you brought the other 20% in cold, hard cash. And the lower that LTV number is, the happier your lender is going to be.
But let me ask you, what actually happens when you don't have that ideal 20% saved up for a down payment? Are you just completely out of luck?
Well, no, you're not out of luck, but it is going to cost you. And that cost comes in the form of PMI, or private mortgage insurance. You could basically think of PMI as the bank's personal bodyguard. You're the one paying the monthly premium for it, but it protects them in case you default. Kind of a raw deal, right? But the silver lining here is that it's temporary. Once your equity finally hits that magic 20% mark, you can call them up and drop the PMI.
Now here is a really fascinating strategic move you can make. You can actually buy down the cost of your loan right up front. Think about interest for a second. It's basically just the rent you pay to borrow somebody else's money. Well, if you want cheaper rent for the next 30 years, you can buy discount points. And the math is simple. 1 point equals exactly 1% of your total loan amount.
Let's look at some real numbers to make this concrete. Say a home buyer named Jody takes out a $340,000 loan and she decides to buy 2 discount points to secure a better rate. We just take 2% of that loan amount, which means she pays $6,800 right at closing. So it's a short-term, upfront cost, but it's specifically designed to save her tens of thousands of dollars over the coming decades.
Okay, so your down payment and your points are settled. Now your monthly obligation kicks in. In the industry, they call this the PITI. PITI. It is the ultimate all-in-one package deal. Your monthly check covers the principal and interest going to the bank, plus your property taxes and your homeowner's insurance, the whole shebang.
So how does a bank actually build that payment? Let's say Bob and Susan are buying a $125,000 house with an 80% LTV. That leaves them with a $100,000 loan. Now, banks use these old-school per $1,000 factor charts. So, dividing their loan by 1,000 gives us a multiplier of 100. If their interest rate factor off the chart is 8.06, we just multiply 100 by 8.06, and boom, their principal and interest payment is exactly $806 a month.
And sealing all of this math together, making it completely official, is the paperwork. Now, the mortgage itself ties the debt to the physical property, but the promissory note is your actual legal IOU. It is the binding contract where you formally promise to pay back every single cent of that principal and interest under those defined terms. No backing out. All right. Part 3, the 1930s mortgage revolution, rising from the ashes of the 1920s.
Let's zoom back out. That steady, predictable 30-year fixed mortgage we were just talking about? Yeah, it didn't always exist. In fact, in the 1920s, the system was wildly different and a lot more dangerous. A typical mortgage was just a 5-year loan with a strict 60% LTV. You literally only paid the interest for those 5 years, and then at the end, bam! You were hit with a massive balloon payment for the entire principal of the house all at once. And when the Great Depression hit, property values plummeted. Banks refused to refinance, and millions of families were absolutely crushed by those balloon payments.
It was the greatest housing crisis in U.S. history. The government literally had to completely reinvent real estate finance to save it. Starting in 1933, they stepped in and replaced those toxic balloon notes with 15-year self-amortizing loans, meaning you gradually pay down the principal over time. Then came 20-year loans and the creation of Fannie Mae to inject much-needed cash into the system. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. Out of the ashes of the Depression, they engineered the incredibly stable mortgage mechanics that we rely on today.
Which brings us to Part 4, Anatomy of a Housing Bubble, looking at the macro psychology of real estate. Now that we got the financial and historical groundwork laid out, we have to ask, why do housing markets, despite all these steady, mechanical rules, still occasionally completely lose their minds? Well, Yale professor Robert Shiller mapped out 100 years of home prices, and he noticed a fascinating shift. The big housing boom after World War II, that was based on physical reality. Returning soldiers, the baby boom, there was a desperate physical need for houses. But recent bubbles, they are entirely different beasts. They aren't driven by population spikes or the cost of lumber. They are driven almost entirely by human psychology.
Shiller's research highlights a staggering contrast. Just compare buyers in Los Angeles versus Milwaukee. LA was what he calls a glamour market. Buyers there fully expected massive 10% annual gains, year after year. And an incredible 80% of them bought homes out of pure panic, terrified they'd be priced out of the market forever. Meanwhile, over in historically stable Milwaukee, buyers expected modest 4% gains, and only 27% felt any sort of fear of missing out. Day and night.
So the ultimate fuel for these extreme market fluctuations, it isn't just fluctuating interest rates or tweaking loan-to-value ratios. It's deeply, deeply human. As Professor Shiller explicitly puts it, it is the irrational, collective fear of missing the boat. When a market starts going up, human beings just naturally extrapolate that curve upward forever into the future, and logic completely goes out the window.
And this is the critical takeaway for us today. Real estate used to be highly local, right? Milwaukee frankly didn't care what Los Angeles was doing. But as globalization constantly connects us, Shiller's data shows that this glamour city FOMO is spreading globally, jumping from stable US markets all the way across the ocean to places like London and Norway. So I'm going to leave you with this question. If the whole world is starting to think and panic exactly like Los Angeles, are we building our financial futures on solid math or just collective anxiety? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.